Usually when you look at a massive, gleaming architectural project, like a towering new skyscraper right in the center of a major city, you just kind of assume the engineers agreed on how the foundation was built.
Right, you see the clean glass lines, the elevators working smoothly, and you just assume there's a total structural consensus keeping the whole thing upright.
Exactly. But imagine taking the elevator all the way down to the sub-basement, walking into the main control room, and realizing the people running the building are in this bitter, almost existential war.
A war over whether the concrete is actually going to hold or, if the entire structure was just a fatal mistake to begin with.
Yeah, and today we are taking a really close magnifying glass to a conversation that is happening right in that political basement.
We're looking at a landscape that is, well, its absolute definition of structural muddy waters.
Totally. What looks cohesive and unified from a distance, I mean, the European Union, is actually a site of intense ideological conflict when you get up close.
It really is.
And before we jumped in, we just need to be super clear with you, the listener, because we are dealing with some highly polarized figures today. We are acting purely as your neutral guides here.
Right. We absolutely are not here to validate or debunk any of these claims.
Exactly. And we certainly aren't taking sides with either the left-wing or the right-wing perspectives presented in this material.
Our only mission today is to forensically map out the arguments being made in the room, just so you can actually understand the ideological battles that are, frankly, shaking the foundations of Brussels.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So the source material for this deep dive is a YouTube transcript from the channel Phidias EU Parliament.
It features this really candid conversation between the channel's host, Phidias, who is an MEP from Cyprus, and Christine Anderson.
Right, and Christine Anderson is a highly controversial member of the European Parliament. She represents Germany's AfD party.
And their discussion, it's essentially a blueprint of the modern populist critique of centralized power.
It really covers a lot of ground. They unpack specific structural grievances against the EU, they debate the actual boundaries of free speech, and they really wrestle with this ongoing tension between national sovereignty and a centralized European authority.
It is a dense conversation.
Okay, let's unpack this. The interview kicks off with a dynamic that feels, less like a standard parliamentary policy debate and more like a targeted demolition.
Yeah, demolition is a good word for it. Anderson does not mince words at all.
No, she doesn't. She essentially positions herself as the worst nightmare of Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the EU Commission.
Right, and she doesn't just attack von der Leyen's current policies in Brussels. She actually bases this on a really specific critique of her career trajectory in German domestic politics, way before she ever even arrived in Brussels.
Yeah, Anderson goes directly for von der Leyen's track record. She specifically points out her previous cabinet positions in Germany, like when she was Minister of Defense and Minister of Family Affairs.
And Anderson claims that von der Leyen was basically a complete failure in those roles.
A total failure. The argument here is that she managed to botch pretty much every major initiative she touched in domestic government.
Which sets up this really incredible paradox that Anderson leans into.
Right, like how does a politician who allegedly fails consistently at the national level continuously get promoted to the absolute highest executive position in the entire European Union?
I struggle to understand the mechanics of that myself.
Right. In a normal corporate environment, if a middle manager spectacularly blows the budget and just alienates the entire team on every single project, they get fired.
You definitely don't get promoted to CEO.
Exactly. So how does this upward failure actually happen in the EU system?
Well, that is the exact friction point Anderson is highlighting. And it really comes down to how the EU Commission president is selected in the first place.
Because it isn't a direct election by the European citizens, right?
Yeah, exactly. The president is proposed by the European Council, which is basically the heads of state of the member countries, and then they are elected by the European Parliament.
So the voters aren't directly checking a box for her.
Right. And Anderson is arguing that this opaque sort of backroom appointment process allows political insiders to totally insulate themselves from their domestic failures.
So if you have the right connections among the national leaders, you can just be elevated to the EU executive branch regardless of your popularity.
Yeah, or regardless of your track record with actual voters on the ground in your home country.
Wow. And she uses a globally recognized event to really anchor this critique of insulated power, right? The handling of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, heavily. Anderson zeroes in on the vaccine contracts signed by the EU.
Yeah, she heavily criticizes von der Leyen's personal involvement with Pfizer and its CEO, Albert Bourla.
We are talking about contracts for 4.3 billion doses of mRNA vaccines.
4.3 billion doses. That number is just staggering.
It is crucial to the argument. I mean, think about it. 4.3 billion doses for a continent with a population of roughly 450 million people.
That's almost 10 doses for every single person. That's wild.
And Anderson uses this staggering volume to illustrate what she sees as a grotesque overreach of centralized power.
Because these contracts were negotiated at the EU level through a mechanism called joint procurement, right?
Yes. The original idea was to prevent member states from outbidding each other during a crisis, which sounds reasonable in theory.
Right. You don't want Germany and France getting into a bidding war over medical supplies.
Exactly. But the mechanism effectively locked 27 sovereign nations into a massive centralized purchase agreement.
Wait, if these contracts were so universally binding, what was the mechanism that prevented a single country from just saying, no, we don't want this many doses, we're opting out?
Well, once that joint procurement agreement is activated and the Commission is mandated to negotiate on behalf of the member states, the individual countries essentially lose their unilateral negotiating power.
So they're just bound by whatever terms are struck in Brussels.
Right. And Anderson argues this is disastrous because it completely removes local accountability.
And she takes an extremely severe stance on the vaccines themselves, doesn't she?
Very severe. She claims they were completely useless at best and fatal at worst.
Right. But she pairs that sort of medical claim with a very structural economic reality.
Yeah, she points out that pharmaceutical companies made billions of euros in guaranteed profits while being completely shielded from standard liability for any adverse effects.
Now, Phidias pushes back a bit on the absolute nature of her vaccine statistics here.
He does. He admits he isn't entirely sure about the claim that they didn't help anyone at all.
But what's fascinating is that he fiercely agrees with her overarching point that the entire pandemic management was a total disaster.
Oh yeah, he brings in his own lived experience from Cyprus, which sounds incredibly dystopian, honestly.
Yeah, he describes these extreme lockdowns where citizens literally had to send a text message to the government just to request permission to step outside their homes to exercise.
A text message to go outside. It's just crazy to think about.
So you have two very different vantage points arriving at the exact same conclusion here.
Exactly. Anderson is looking at the macro level, multi-billion euro corporate contracts and hidden text messages between EU executives and pharmaceutical CEOs.
And Phidias is looking at the micro level, the sheer absurdity of a citizen having to text a bureaucracy just to go for a jog.
But they both see a massive failure of leadership and a total abuse of centralized authority.
Why is this specific angle, the focus on Pfizer, the liability shields, the unelected power, why is this so central to Anderson's rhetoric? Is it just about COVID, or is COVID a proxy for a larger argument?
Well, COVID is the ultimate proxy for her larger argument about lobbying and corporate capture.
How so?
Well, by focusing on these unelected corporate deals, Anderson is tapping into a really potent populist critique. The idea that the EU structurally prioritizes multinational corporations over regular citizens.
Oh, I see.
Because the tactical logic, she points out, is chillingly pragmatic. If you are a massive pharmaceutical or tech conglomerate, lobbying 27 independent sovereign national parliaments is an absolute nightmare.
Right, because it requires 27 different strategies, translating into multiple languages, navigating 27 different sets of domestic political pressures.
Exactly. So centralization isn't necessarily about creating efficiency for the everyday European citizen.
It's about creating efficiency for the lobbyists.
Bingo. If you consolidate all the buying power and regulatory authority into one commission in Brussels, a corporation only has to lobby one small group of executives.
That is the exact mechanism Anderson is exposing here, and it reveals that her critique of Ursula von der Leyen is not merely a personal vendetta against a political rival.
No, it is a fundamental philosophical rejection of the entire concept of the European Union as a governing body.
And the interview actually takes a really sharp turn right here. Phidias asks Anderson point blank if she wants to abolish Europe.
And her reaction is immediate.
She vehemently corrects him. She makes this massive distinction between the continent of Europe and the institution of the European Union.
Right. She talks about how much she actually loves Europe, the distinct cultures, the different languages.
Yeah, she contrasts the stiffness of Germany with the relaxed vibe of Italy, and she says she wants to preserve all of that.
But what she believes is destroying that diversity is the European Union's attempt to forge this homogenous United States of Europe.
This touches on probably the most profound philosophical debate in political science regarding the EU.
It really does.
Mm.
Anderson argues that for a true functioning democracy to exist, you first need a unified people, which political theorists call a demos.
Right, a demos, a population with a shared collective identity that can form and voice a coherent political will.
And her core claim is that there is no such thing as a European people.
She points to language as the primary barrier preventing this demos from forming, doesn't she?
She does. Her argument is that without a common, everyday language, citizens across 27 different countries simply cannot intelligently debate the incredibly complex nuances of how they want to be governed.
That makes sense. I mean, you can't really have a shared democratic debate in the public square if the participants literally cannot understand the subtle connotations of what the other person is advocating for.
Exactly. She even conceives that maybe, hundreds of years in the future, if language barriers completely evaporate, the situation might change.
But as it stands today, she believes you cannot artificially force a shared political fate onto distinct populations who just don't share a collective memory.
Or a common media landscape, or a unified way of communicating.
Because the policies that benefit the agricultural sector in Poland might absolutely devastate the tech sector in Ireland.
And without a shared language to negotiate that friction, the system relies on top-down imposition rather than true democratic consensus.
So what does this all mean in the context of modern technology? I mean, we have instant AI translation now.
That's true.
You can hold up your phone and have a near-perfect real-time translation of a speech in Italian directly into German. Is Anderson's argument about the language barrier becoming obsolete? Or is she pointing to a cultural baseline that AI just can't translate?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, AI might solve the literal translation problem, but it really doesn't solve the cultural context problem.
Right. Translation doesn't create a shared media ecosystem or a unified historical perspective.
More importantly, Anderson uses this cultural fragmentation to explain a much deeper structural flaw in how power is actually exercised in the EU.
She breaks down a concept that fundamentally bypasses national parliaments, and it is a vital mechanism to understand.
Yes.
Let's get into the mechanics of this, because this concept completely reframes how I understand European politics. She uses Germany as the baseline example.
Right. Traditionally, if the German government wants to pass a new law, they propose it to the Bundestag, which is the elected parliament representing the German people.
And if the Bundestag votes no, the law is dead. The legislature checks the power of the executive. That is just basic textbook democracy.
But Anderson claims the EU allows politicians to completely bypass that check.
So how does that actually work in practice?
It's often referred to as the executive loop, and it works through an institution called the Council of the European Union, or sometimes called the Council of Ministers.
Okay.
Let's say a German minister wants to pass an environmental regulation, but they know the German parliament will reject it because it hurts local industry.
Okay, so they know they can't win at home.
Right. So instead of fighting that losing battle at home, that minister travels to Brussels and sits on the council with the ministers from the other 26 member states.
And they negotiate and pass the law at the EU level.
Exactly.
Wait, so the national executives just get together in a room in Brussels, agree on a policy, and then what? How does it become law back in Germany if the German parliament never actually approved it?
Because once the council and the EU parliament pass it as an EU directive or regulation, it legally supersedes national law.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it is sent back down to Germany, and the country is now legally obligated to implement it.
So the German parliament's role is reduced to just merely rubber stamping the administrative details of a policy they never even consented to.
Precisely. The local executive bypassed their own legislature, used the supranational EU structure to pass the law, and then forced it back onto their own citizens.
That is a staggering shift in sovereignty. It essentially blends executive and legislative powers at the Brussels level.
Completely insulating the decision makers from the local voters, who will actually feel the impact of the law.
Phidias offers a really critical counter-perspective to this, though, representing the reality of smaller member states.
He does, because Cyprus only has a population of about 1 million people.
Right. He points out that being part of a massive 450 million person economic bloc is an absolute necessity for survival.
He argues that the centralized structure gives small countries leverage. It gives them negotiating power and the ability to strike global trade deals that a tiny island nation could literally never achieve on its own.
It's the eternal political struggle, right? Administrative efficiency and global leverage on one side versus localized self-determination and direct democratic accountability on the other.
Exactly. But Anderson has a very sharp rebuttal to Phidias's defense of leverage.
She agrees that leverage sounds great in theory, but she argues the EU actually uses that leverage as a tool for blackmail against its own member states.
She cites Poland and Hungary as primary examples of this.
Yeah, her argument is that if a sovereign country refuses to implement a centralized mandate, she specifically mentions the mandate to open borders and accept migrant quotas, the EU threatens to withhold billions of euros in funding.
The EU has these mechanisms, like the rule of law conditionality regulation, which basically allow them to freeze budget allocations to countries that don't comply with Brussels standards.
So, the immense economic power that Phidias sees as a protective shield for small countries, Anderson just sees as a weapon used to force compliance and override the will of domestic voters.
That's her exact point.
And if a political system is structurally designed to bypass the local legislature and then uses financial blackmail to enforce top-down mandates, it fundamentally alters how that system handles dissent.
It has to. If you can't vote against a policy locally because your parliament has been bypassed, your only recourse left is to speak out against it publicly.
And that brings us directly to Anderson's explosive claims about what happens when you do speak out.
Right. The current battleground over censorship, speech, and what is allowed to be said in Europe today.
The transition from structural bypassing to narrative control seems almost inevitable.
If centralized power is insulated from direct local legislative checks, maintaining a unified public consensus around that power becomes paramount.
Because any dissent threatens the perceived legitimacy of the structure itself.
Exactly. And Anderson makes a very bold, uncompromising claim here. She states that while freedom of speech exists on paper in Europe, de facto, in practical reality, it is entirely gone.
She is fierce on this point. She argues that the only true value of free speech is the right to offend, to disturb, and to disrupt the consensus.
Which is a classic free speech absolutist position.
Right. She points out the obvious. You don't need constitutional protection for statements that everyone already likes to hear.
No. If I stand in the town square and say the sky is blue and the government is doing a great job, I don't need an amendment to protect me.
Right. I only need protection when I criticize authority or say something that makes the majority deeply uncomfortable.
And she grounds this philosophical stance in a highly personal anecdote that highlights the severe cultural friction inside the parliament.
She recants this incident during a committee meeting where she stated, "There are exactly two sexes, men and women."
She points out that this is an objective, biological reality in her view. Yet, making that statement led to her being formally investigated for committing a hate crime right there in the middle of a political committee.
She acts almost baffled by the institutional response to it.
She jokes about it, asking if the committee members thought she had pulled out a knife and physically attacked someone.
Yeah, she simply stated what she views as a basic biological fact, and the procedural response was to treat her words as an act of dangerous criminality.
And this leads to her breakdown of how speech is currently being categorized and policed by the establishment, which is frankly terrifying.
She outlines 3 specific categories of information.
The evolution of these definitions is critical to understand how speech is managed today.
Okay, so first you have misinformation.
Right. This is the unintentional spreading of falsehoods. You just simply got your facts wrong. You read a bad source and repeated it, but there's no malicious intent.
Right, just a mistake. Second, you have disinformation.
This is the intentional, calculated spreading of falsehoods. You know the information is a lie, but you spread it anyway to cause confusion or damage.
But the third category, the one Anderson focuses on as the primary tool of censorship, is malinformation.
Malinformation. According to Anderson, malinformation is defined as a factually, objectively correct statement that the establishment deems harmful.
Let me use an analogy to process the mechanics of this, because it's wild. Imagine you are playing in a highly competitive sports match.
Okay.
You execute a completely legal move. You don't break a single rule in the playbook. But the referee blows the whistle and penalizes you anyway, not because you broke a rule, but simply because the referee decided your perfectly legal move was harmful to the opposing team's morale or, disrupted the flow of the game they wanted to see.
That analogy perfectly isolates the danger of the concept. You are being penalized for the effect of the truth rather than the absence of it.
Exactly. The establishment is admitting the statement is factually accurate, but punishing the speaker because the facts themselves undermine the preferred narrative.
Which raises a profound, unavoidable question. Who gets to be the referee? Who gets to blow the whistle?
Anderson explicitly asks this. Is it Ursula von der Leyen? Who has the divine right to decide that a demonstrably true statement is no longer allowed to be spoken in the public square just because it causes harm?
Phidias and Anderson dive deep into the institutional hypocrisy surrounding this desire for control.
Phidias brings up the Democracy Shield Committee, which they both apparently sit on.
He notes the profound absurdity that the EU spends 90% of its time wringing its hands over external threats, specifically Russian interference in EU elections.
Right, while simultaneously, the EU establishment is actively interfering in the elections of its own member states.
Anderson provides a concrete example from Romania, claiming a political candidate was banned from running based on unproven, establishment-driven allegations of being a Russian spy.
The hypocrisy they're dissecting is that the EU presents itself as terrified of external manipulation, yet appears entirely comfortable utilizing internal manipulation, legal hurdles, and speech policing to maintain its own status quo.
Anderson goes incredibly far with this critique. She compares the EU's current trajectory of surveillance directly to the Stasi.
The notoriously brutal secret police of the Soviet-controlled German Democratic Republic.
Yes, she points to modern legislative pushes like chat control.
We should really explain what chat control actually entails because it's vital context.
It's a proposed EU regulation that would obligate tech companies to scan all private digital communications. Your text messages, your emails, your encrypted chats.
Looking for illegal material, ostensibly to fight child abuse.
But the mechanism requires what's called client-side scanning, meaning the surveillance software lives on your actual device, scanning your messages before they are even encrypted and sent.
So it's not just a wiretap on the network, it's placing a permanent government informant inside every single smartphone in Europe.
She argues these aren't just tools to protect vulnerable citizens. They are the architectural blueprints of a totalitarian regime.
She makes a grim historical observation about this. She notes that the Stasi ultimately failed because they suffocated under the weight of physical paper files.
They couldn't process the sheer volume of surveillance data.
But today, with AI, algorithms, and immense computing power, a centralized state could effortlessly catalog every detail, every opinion, and every private joke of every single citizen.
She makes a brilliant, chilling, philosophical distinction regarding this surveillance. She says that in a functioning democracy, the citizens have the absolute right to know everything about what the government is doing.
Right, but in a tyranny, the dynamic flips. The government demands to know everything about what the citizen is doing.
By labeling factual dissent as malinformation and building out this massive surveillance infrastructure, she argues the establishment is not acting out of a noble desire to protect democracy.
They are acting out of a deep structural fear of it.
Exactly. They are terrified of what the voters might actually choose if they had access to all the facts and the freedom to debate them.
She drives this home with a heavy historical point. She reminds Phidias that the institutional consensus is historically, almost reliably wrong.
She brings up the astronomical shift. There was a time when the absolute consensus of the smartest people in power was that the sun revolved around the earth.
Right, and the one guy who looked at the math and said otherwise was tortured and silenced because his facts were deemed harmful to the institutional power of the church.
But that one guy was right.
If you build a system that silences the disruptor simply because their facts cause friction, you permanently destroy a society's ability to correct its own mistakes and arrive at the truth.
And when you operate in a political environment with those stakes, holding fiercely anti-establishment system-disrupting views doesn't just make you an outlier.
No, if you refuse to back down when you are investigated for stating biological facts, you don't get to be a quiet backbencher. You become a massive glowing target for the entire political apparatus.
Phidias addresses this reality head-on. He flat out asks Anderson if she is the most hated woman in the EU Parliament.
And I have to say, her reaction is fascinating. She doesn't flinch, she doesn't play the victim, and she doesn't try to soften her image at all.
She completely embraces the hatred.
She states that considering how fundamentally corrupt and broken she believes the institution is, if everyone in that building actually liked her, it would mean she was doing something terribly wrong.
She leans entirely into the friction. But she also breaks down the actual mechanical political strategy behind this hatred.
She discusses the concept of the Brandmauer, which translates to the firewall or the cordon sanitaire.
This isn't just people disliking her in the hallway. This is a deliberate, highly coordinated political strategy where all the other established centrist parties formally agreed to refuse to collaborate with, vote with, or assign any committee leadership roles to the AFD in any capacity.
I want to understand how that actually functions in practice. If the AFD gets elected by millions of citizens, how does the firewall legally keep them out of power in the parliament?
In the European Parliament, committee chairs and administrative roles are typically distributed proportionally based on the size of the political groups, using a mathematical formula called the Dont-Hat method.
Okay, so it's a math equation. If your group is large enough, you are mathematically entitled to chair a certain number of committees.
Exactly. But the establishment groups use the cordon sanitaire to break this convention. When it's time to confirm an AFD member for a role they are mathematically owed, the other groups unite to vote them down.
So they're entirely freezing them out of the legislative machinery.
Right. But Anderson notes a really interesting leak in this strategy when it comes to the EU Parliament versus German domestic politics.
She says the firewall is incredibly strict inside the German Bundestag. No one crosses it. But in Brussels, it gets porous.
Why? Because an MEP from Poland or Italy doesn't care about internal German political taboos.
If a Polish MEP wants to get an agricultural policy passed, and the AFD's votes will get them over the finish line, they will quietly ignore the German firewall and work together to get the math right.
It reveals how supranational bodies can inadvertently dilute national political taboos. The ideological purity of the firewall crumbles in the face of pragmatic vote counting.
However, outside those backroom negotiations, the rhetorical attacks and the labels applied to her party have relentlessly escalated over the past decade.
She maps out the timeline of this escalation. When the AFD was founded in 2013, they were primarily a conservative economics party criticizing the euro currency.
So they were just labeled anti-European.
Then, during the 2015 migrant crisis, the label escalated to xenophobes and racists.
As they continued to grow, it escalated to fascists, and finally, the establishment just started calling them Hitler.
She points out the strategic absurdity of this escalation. Once you call your political opponent Hitler, you have reached the absolute rhetorical ceiling.
That there is no worse label to apply. You are completely out of ammunition.
But because the party keeps growing in popularity despite these labels, the establishment's words are losing their power.
But we aren't just talking about harsh words in newspapers here. Anderson details how this relentless rhetorical escalation has bled directly into terrifying, real-world physical violence against her and her colleagues.
The transcript details a chilling event from 2015 that highlights the physical danger of this polarization.
Anderson describes attending a political protest with about 70 AFD members.
And she says they were completely surrounded by a mob of what she estimates to be 4,000 Antifa members.
4,000 against 70, the situation deteriorated into violence quickly.
She describes being physically struck in the head with a rock and knocked to the ground.
She states unequivocally that even with the police present, if that mob had managed to break the lines and get their hands on the small group of AFD members, they would have beaten them to death right there in the street.
That is horrifying. It is political violence in its rawest form.
And yet her response to this constant environment of physical intimidation and hatred is incredibly defiant.
She tells a story about her own private home to illustrate her mindset.
Yeah, vandals showed up and painted an intimidating, massive piece of graffiti on the side of her house that read, "Make racists afraid again."
Now, I think most politicians, or most people in general, would immediately hire a crew to paint over it, install high-definition security cameras, and try to lower their profile.
But Anderson's reaction was the exact opposite. She didn't cover it up at all.
She literally hired someone to bolt a huge, ornate frame around the graffiti directly onto the wall of her house,
turning the vandalism into a permanent monument of her own refusal to be intimidated.
She left it there as a daily message back to the activists. Your terror tactics are not working, and I am not hiding.
Let me throw a structural question to you based on all of this. When the political establishment utilizes a strict cordon sanitaire, a total firewall, to entirely block out a democratically elected party,
Right.
labels them the worst things imaginable, and effectively tries to excommunicate them from polite political society, does that actually protect the democratic system from extremism? Or does it inadvertently turn that ostracized party into anti-establishment martyrs?
validating their claims that the system is rigged.
Exactly, and ultimately fueling their explosive growth.
What's fascinating here is that the tactical realities and the electoral results seem to answer your question definitively.
Despite this immense, coordinated, continent-wide firewall, Anderson points out that the AfD has grown significantly.
They now have 15 MEPs in the parliament, and they are part of a larger, newly formed sovereignist bloc of 27 members.
The institutional ostracization hasn't destroyed them at all. It has hardened their base, improved their polling, and confirmed their narrative that the establishment is terrified of them.
Phidias makes an incredible, highly perceptive observation about how this firewall warps normal political behavior inside the chamber.
He notes that, ironically, the far-left groups and the far-right groups in the parliament often end up voting the exact same way on major structural issues.
Specifically on things concerning freedom of speech, censorship, and opposition to foreign wars.
It is a textbook, real-world illustration of the horseshoe theory in political science.
The theory posits that if you travel far enough out to the extreme left and far enough out to the extreme right, the ends of the political spectrum don't stay on a straight line.
They bend toward each other, eventually looking very similar.
They unite in their shared opposition to the entrenched, centrist establishment power.
Both the far left and the far right view the centrist consensus as a corrupting authoritarian force that serves corporate interests over people, even if they violently disagree on what the alternative system should look like.
It is wild to think about.
You have all this intense insider parliamentary drama, the executive loops, the dissent method being bypassed by firewalls, the horseshoe voting alliances, the committee fights over hate speech.
And if you are listening to this right now, wherever you are, you might be thinking, okay, this is fascinating political theater, but it feels incredibly distant.
Right. It's happening in Brussels, in these echo chambers of power. Why do the mechanics of a European directive actually matter to my daily life?
But Anderson and Phidias end their conversation by making a forceful, mathematically terrifying case for why this exact bureaucracy dictates almost everything around you.
They absolutely do. This is where the conversation pivots from the philosophical theories of democracy to the highly practical reality of your wallet and your freedom.
Anderson makes a startling, concrete claim. She states that 80% of the problems, the economic costs, and the frustrating regulations that are making daily life difficult for citizens in the member states right now originate directly from the EU, not from the local national governments.
Wait, 80%? How is that even measured? If I am a business owner in France or a farmer in the Netherlands, is she saying that 80% of the red tape I deal with was written in Brussels, not my own capital?
Yes. While the exact percentage is debated among academics, the sheer volume of EU law is undeniable.
Because the EU passes directives, which are broad goals that member states must achieve by writing their own local laws, and regulations which are instantly binding across all 27 countries the moment they pass in Brussels.
Environmental standards, energy mandates, tech compliance, labor rules, the vast majority of the regulatory framework is constructed centrally.
If she is right, it means the vast majority of the bureaucratic friction you feel in your life isn't coming from the mayor you just voted for, or the parliament you watch on domestic TV. It is coming from a committee in Brussels you have never heard of.
And Phidias admits to a massive, deeply concerning information gap regarding this staggering power.
He says his own constituents in Cyprus, the actual people who voted for him, have absolutely no idea how their own national president votes when he travels to the EU Council.
The decisions that will reshape the Cypriot economy are made behind closed doors, and the voters are entirely blind to it.
That is the core tragedy they are highlighting. You have an institution with almost incomprehensible power that trickles down to dictate the daily lives, the energy bills, and the speech parameters of 450 million people.
And the people wielding this power are highly compensated, insulating them further from the economic realities of the citizens.
Anderson and Phidias explicitly discuss their salaries to make this point, don't they?
They do. As MEPs, they make roughly 8,500 euros a month in base salary, plus a 350 euro daily per diem, just for signing a register to prove they showed up.
Plus massive budgets for staff and offices. It brings their personal take-home to well over 12,000 euros a month.
Over 12,000 euros a month, completely tax-advantaged compared to normal citizens.
For a parliament that, according to Anderson's earlier breakdown of the executive loop, is largely a facade for democracy because the unelected executive commission and the council of ministers really call the shots.
And yet, despite the massive amounts of money being spent and the total impact on daily life, the average European voter remains utterly disengaged.
Phidias tries to use his massive YouTube and social media presence to bridge this gap and explain these laws to the youth, but he hits that exact language barrier Anderson theorized about earlier.
He can use AI to dub his videos, but he laments that his real cultural reach, his ability to truly explain the nuances of these laws, is functionally limited to the Greek-speaking world.
This structural apathy is exactly what Anderson is fighting against. She argues forcefully that the establishment does not view public ignorance as a problem to be solved. They view it as an asset to be exploited.
They want the public to think EU politics is boring, dense, and overly bureaucratic, because that widespread apathy is the fertile soil in which top-down, undemocratic changes can flourish completely unnoticed by the masses.
Which brings us to the final sobering moment of the interview. Phidias asks her a deeply personal question. If she had only 30 seconds left to live on this planet, what would her final words be?
And her answer isn't a petty attack on her rivals.
No, it isn't about her party's polling numbers, or Ursula von der Leyen, or even the borders of Europe. Her final words would be a simple, urgent plea. Democracy is worth protecting. Protect it by all means.
It is a profound distillation of her entire worldview. Despite the relentless accusations against her of being an anti-democratic extremist, her core stated operating principle is that the people must remain the undisputed boss of the government.
Any system, no matter how efficient, wealthy, or well-intentioned, that deliberately obscures that relationship and insulates power from the voter must be fiercely dismantled.
We have covered incredible dense ground today.
We really have. We started by looking at Anderson's fierce critiques of the upward mobility of failed domestic politicians into EU leadership.
We broke down the staggering scale of the Pfizer joint procurement contracts and the corporate lobbying efficiency of centralized power.
We unpacked the mechanical bypassing of national sovereignty through the executive loop of the EU Council.
We waded into the murky, highly dangerous waters of malinformation and the institutional policing of objective facts.
And we explored the intense polarization, the physical violence, and the ultimate failure of the cordon sanitaire to stop the growth of the AfD.
And through all of these distinct topics, we've seen the recurring, unavoidable theme, a massive, widening disconnect between the administrative rulers in Brussels and the everyday citizens living in the member states.
Again, our goal here was not to validate Anderson's claims, but to deeply understand the structural and philosophical arguments that are currently shaking the foundations of the European project.
We want to leave you, the listener, with the structural blueprint of these arguments so you can examine the building yourself.
And as we wrap up, I want to bring us back to that gleaming skyscraper we talked about at the beginning. As modern technology and AI make top-down governance, mass surveillance, and rapid global coordination easier and more efficient than ever before in human history, does the massive centralized scale of an institution like the EU become its greatest strength in a dangerous, highly competitive world?
Or does that very same scale become the exact mechanism that permanently erodes our ability to govern our own local communities?
Are we building an impenetrable fortress to protect ourselves, or are we quietly engineering an inescapable page?
This is a huge question to ponder.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structure of the world around you, and we'll see you next time.